Okay, we're going to get started. Greetings, everybody. Welcome to the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition third Tuesday of the month general meeting webinar. My name is Hamid Khan with Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. My pronouns are he, him. And this is our webinar number 74 since we shifted because of COVID from in-person meetings at our home in Skid Row to our presence online. And that shift took place on March 24th of 2020. And since then, we probably have missed maybe 3 or 4 Tuesdays over the last 18 months, but been hanging in there. And our goal has been to keep on building, keep that consistency going, engage in collective conversation, and build our power and journey towards abolition of the police state. And today is our general meeting, third Tuesday of the month, where we look at the political landscape typically and how it impacts our life. What is the state of the national security police state, and what is our fight? Typically, the month is, the 4 Tuesdays are distributed in 3 sort of more distinct conversations. The first Tuesday of the month is about how the national security police state intersects with gender and sexuality, which our comrades Chela Coleman and Mariela Saba co-lead. The second Tuesday of the month is committed to the war on youth, which is primarily led by Akhil Gopal, with support from Nadia Khan. The third Tuesday is the general meeting, and then the fourth Tuesday is dedicated to data-driven policing and how it keeps on feeding the national security police state, looking specifically at the Los Angeles Police Department as a model that keeps on building and keeps on expanding its footprint in our lives. So today we are going to, it's a very special conversation with 2 very cool and awesome comrades and family and people, Lara Kiswani and Sohail Daulatzai. And once we get to that point, we'll do the introductions. But today is a conversation about, just kind of not to harp too much on 9/11, but this year is also the 20th anniversary of 9/11. So it also is an opportunity for us to reflect, to have some critical reflection on how the national security police state has expanded since the events of 9/11, but particularly what has been the role of the community, the folks in the Muslim community, in the Middle Eastern community, the South Asian community, Arab communities, into further collaborating, which has emboldened and fueled further expansion of the national security police state. This is a vast area of conversation, and at the expense of not sounding too insular, we want to just discuss, because surveillance and spying and infiltration is our primary lane. So we want to focus more on the expansion of the national security police state, but very much being also grounded on how the anti-Muslim racism impacts U.S. and expands and further fuels U.S. imperialism and the devastation that U.S. imperialism causes, and how Zionism becomes a central theme as well, and how that continues to expand and impact our lives. So a lot to talk about. And this is also on when we released a statement on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, which I'm going to put the link in there so folks can have a chance to read it too. But in order for us to get started, I'm going to invite my colleague, my comrade, Shakir Rahman, to just speak about some of the broad contours of the statement that we put out, and then we'll move into our conversation with Laura and Sohail. So Shakir, passing it on to you.
Thank you. And yeah, hi, everyone. So we published this statement on the September 11th anniversary, kind of to use the moment to reflect on like sort of the policing structures that have been built in the past 2 decades, and just even the advocacy and the reactions and the journey of our communities, as well as kind of, yeah, the journey of the political advocacy around 9/11. And we were prompted in part by seeing like sort of the reactions of Muslim advocacy groups and civil rights organizations to the anniversary, highlighting the impact of Islamophobia over the past 2 decades. And Islamophobia is a real source of violence and harm, of course, but we wanted to kind of really center beyond the impact on Muslims alone, recognizing how anti-Muslim racism over these past 2 decades and sort of the demonization of Muslims, South Asians, Middle Easterners was a strategy that was used to build up national security policing structures that today are like the rest of the kind of national security police state, are predominantly targeting the same Black, brown, poor communities that the police that have always been dominated and oppressed through policing in this country. That's obviously, and even just that pattern of kind of demonization and fear of other and kind of creation of being used to expand the powers of the state to go after the same people that have gone after historically. That's a pattern that's long existed too. And so in that reflecting, we also wanted to reflect on, like I said, the kind of advocacy ecosystem and its role in facilitating or securing different structures over time. Just kind of using the moment for self-reflection and thinking about, for example, early after 9/11, Muslim advocacy groups were kind of a common framing was that this national security surveillance and policing that's developing is very discriminatory towards Muslims, and we need kind of to develop criteria that are less discriminatory, more neutral. And that was obviously, a reaction that was coming from and described as on behalf of an impacted community and trying to reduce their harm. But that advocacy was then used and that advocacy facilitated kind of policing programs that are in a sense more neutral, but only in that they expand police discretion and powers for criminalization and surveillance, expanding that discretion to mean that police can, apply the criteria more neutrally, or looking for behaviors that are deemed suspicious more broadly. And so we talk about the suspicious activity reporting program, which I think kind of falls into that narrative. And basically, Stop the Peace Buying Coalition was founded in 2011 as a campaign to dismantle LAPD's implementation of that program. Because I mean, basically, when you expand discretion in that way, what we've seen and what the reality is in this country is that police will use those powers always to target the same, as I've been saying, same kind of Black, brown, and poor communities they always go after, and that's exactly what we saw play out. And that was that program has now been around for 10, 12 years. And, even throughout the evolution and refinement of the SAR program, what we've seen is advocacy groups sort of working directly with the federal agencies and with police, kind of, again, from maybe a harm mitigation or trying to address the program in a reformist way, help really to evolve and refine these programs and kind of tinker with them. As a result of that kind of complicity, which we have some details about in the statement, the government is now able to point to the blessing of these organizations to defend its violence when there are, critiques coming from that are more, attacking their roots or kind of abolitionist critiques. And so, yeah, I mean, our main goal in the statement is just sort of to call for self-critique and self-reflection. I mean, that's sort of what abolition, I think, requires. Abolition's all about community accountability, and I think that calls for scrutinizing all of our choices and thinking about everything that we're always doing. All political work is operating still within or really proximate to systems that are extremely adept at absorbing kind of reformist critique in ways that, and then using that to keep expanding the power of the state. And there's a lot of examples of that throughout the construction of realism, of mass incarceration, of racialized policing. We'll be talking about all that today. And the post 9/11 policing is no different from those examples in that history. So yeah, so that's the statement. And I think, yeah, pass it back to you, Hamid.
Thank you, Shakir, for setting that tone. So what we'll do is we just have a couple of both Akil and I have a couple questions that we kind of just framed just to get the conversation started. So and then maybe at the start of the first time, as you are sharing your thoughts on the question, Lara and Sohail, if you can take a couple minutes to introduce yourself and just your journey as well, and then we'll just kind of roll from there. So maybe starting with Lara. So I think, Lara, one of the things we wanted to bring up as Shakir was lifting, that how, from your vantage point, and you've been on the front lines of organizing, particularly fighting back the violence of Zionism and the U.S. imperial state and the impact on Palestine and the Palestinian community all around. But along with that, especially the war on terror, or the so-called war on terror, how have you seen the development of it, especially of this collaborator class? Or the organizations that provide more of a Muslim face to kind of just claim representation, but then further kind of just fuels and expands more of these violent policies and policing and even global imperialism and even Zionism as well. So, and it's your choice. I mean, we don't hold back. We name names as well, but however you want to address it. But but if you can take a minute to introduce yourself, and then maybe let's get into that conversation.
Thanks, Hamid. Thank you all for having me. It was good to be with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition family. My name is Lara Kiswani. As Hamid said, I've been doing work around Palestine, international solidarity, and also organizing working class Arab and Muslims here in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm the executive director of the Arab Resource and Organizing Center. We've been longtime partners of Stop LAPD Spying, and also really inspired by and learned from you all's work and analysis and organizing as it relates to surveillance and connecting it to other working class, poor, Black and brown communities. So appreciate being in conversation also with Sohail today, another scholar and thinker that I am deeply inspired by and follow on a regular. I want to just start by maybe working backwards, because, as we've been reflecting back on these last 20 years, and there's been so many webinars and events and activities and statements about this 20th anniversary, it made me reflect back on some struggles we had in the early 2000s within our community, but also with other communities right after 9/11. And I do want to give credit in terms of how far we've come, right? Both as like an Arab, Muslim, South Asian community members, but also broadly speaking, how far we've come in terms of solidarity with other communities as well, and our deeper analysis of anti-Black racism. I mean, this is all quite relatively new when it comes to our organizations and movements here in the United States. Although our leftist traditions that I come from, and others have historically had that internationalist lens and anti-imperialist lens, understood our struggles as linked to other communities, oppressed communities internationally, right? Not separating that out. But that wasn't always, especially from the 90s and on, wasn't always the way in which work was done. And I just want to name that we do now see today, and we've talked about this a lot around Palestine work, like there's a shifting terrain right now when it comes to Palestine solidarity in the US. Also want to celebrate that as a movement victory. That didn't come out of nowhere. It didn't come from legislators. That came from mass movements really pushing that, both on the ground back home, but also here in the United States. And the movement for Black lives and the ways in which they have exposed the contradictions of racial capitalism and policing, and have really advanced people's critique of policing, broadly speaking. All of these are great victories and wins and have impacted our communities. And I'm going to speak specifically from my vantage point as someone who organizes in the Arab and Muslim community, right? So I've seen shifts there, and I think those are great things, as well as the fact that we've built a lot of resources, we've built organizations, we've built institutions, we've built coalitions, but there's more work to be done. But in terms of when we think about where we are today, how did we get here? And so reflecting back in the early 2000s, it wasn't that easy to make the case, right, that the experience of Arabs and Muslims post 9/11 was connected to other people. and in our community, that was a struggle in of itself, right? So right after 9/11, we had a lot of principled, I would say, political struggle, which is something we need to do more of in our movements, is to really struggle together. I appreciated the opening around critique and self-critique being part of good movement building, and that is absolutely the case. And I think early on, we did struggle with our community around, is this the beginning of some racialization of Arabs and Muslims? Is this the beginning of the criminalization and targeting of Arabs and Muslims? No, it wasn't the beginning, right? So we had to really struggle with not being ahistoric about this moment, 9/11, and how that was actually built on a legacy of colonialism and slavery and criminalization of Arabs and Muslims prior to 9/11. So that wasn't a new thing, especially with US imperialism, and in particular in the case of Palestinians here in the United States. And the ways in which we were used as a case study and a laboratory essentially to also develop some of the surveillance technologies and tactics that have since been advanced and solidified post 9/11. We also really, I think, struggled with being able to connect those dots, right? So we understood that the war on terror was connected to the history of war, endless war making of the United States, like the war on drugs, right? Like the Cold War, but also US foreign policy and wars abroad. And that this was just another step in terms of a war on other working class Black and brown people in this country that was not necessarily taken for granted, right? So we had to do a lot of struggling with each other on that. And we had to make a point that solidarity was necessary in that moment. And we couldn't do it in some kind of transactional way. So there was a lot of movement building that took place that was rooted, I would say, in anti-imperialism. It's those who had an anti-imperialist analysis in the early 2000s that were able to build strong movements and organizations and efforts of, solidarity efforts that shape a lot of what we're seeing today. Another place that I want to name specifically as it relates to that we struggled was the question of Palestine. So today it's taken for granted. You can't talk about US imperialism, you can't talk about war making, and you can't talk about occupation without naming Palestine, right? In the early 2000s, in the anti-war movement, those who were resisting, reacting, mobilizing to the war in Afghanistan, in particular in Iraq, soon after, it wasn't that easy to make the case that this isn't the first war in our region, and also this isn't the first country impacted by US imperialism. And they have a partner called the State of Israel. That's a settler colonial state in our region that has also paved the way for US hegemony and domination, resource extraction, and land theft in the SWANA, Southwest Asia, North Africa region, right? And we had to force our way into the anti-war movement. This wasn't accepted. This wasn't just understood. There were few organizations, and to their credit, the Answer Coalition was one of the few who actually did center Palestine in the anti-war movement. Other coalitions did not. And I think there's a lesson there too to be drawn, because as we're reflecting back 20 years later and paying attention to the conversations that are being had, who is actually talking about the State of Israel when we talk about the war on terror? Who are people making those connections today? Is that being lost in the shuffle? Is the war on terror over because troops left Afghanistan, right? Or is there ongoing policies and structures put in place to ensure US hegemony and US imperialist domination in our region in partnership with the State of Israel? And also, no one's even talking about the role the State of Israel played in endless war making in our region and continues to play in the surveillance and policing globally, right? People often only like to talk about Israel when we talk about how it trains police as a way to say that if they stop training police, that would make police better. We know that's not the case, right? So we understand there's a partnership in a system that revolves around each other because there's shared interests. Lastly, I'll just say that another place, and I think another place that we have more work to be done around this question, is the ways in which early on we did a lot of Arab and Muslim organizations did in fact normalize policing, normalize surveillance, meet with the FBI, have conversations about how this is how we could be better Muslims or Arabs in this country, right? And not there wasn't a harm reduction sort of organizing model or thought process around how to deal with the impacts of the war on terror, the structural impacts of the war on terror. There was this idea that we should play the respectability politics in some arenas. And that's normal. That's part and parcel of the context we're in, because our communities are diverse. Not everyone has a class analysis. Not everyone has a critique of race and power. So it necessitates work on the grassroots to be able to move people to the left and force those conversations. And what I would close by saying for this, this question is just, we've come a long way. So yes, organizations are using the word abolition a lot more. People are talking about defunding. They're talking about racism. They're also using the word imperialism and militarism. There's a lot more Palestine solidarity work. That did not come because people have always thought that and felt that, and they have just continued that work. We want to make sure not to invisibilize the labor of grassroots organizations that actually made that possible in the early 2000s and forced organizations and movements to reckon with the question, where do you stand on these issues, right? And that, I think, is where we're at today.
Thank you, Lara. Really appreciate that. So moving on to you, Sohail. So the same question, if you can take a second to introduce yourself and maybe just roll it from there. And you're muted.
There you go. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yep, great. Thank you all for being here. I want to just show a tremendous amount of gratitude to Stop LAPD Spying. And Hamid. I've been a follower and admirer of Hamid since South Asian Network back in the 90s, and his work there. And also to Lara Kiswani. This is maybe the second or third time we've been on a panel or something together. And want to appreciate the work that you all do up in the Bay Area as well. It's indispensable and it's inspiring. So, and thank you all for the labor that you put in and the time that you're taking right now to come and listen to us, as it were. I guess for me, it's been kind of a journey coming from, I was born in Peshawar, which is now on the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. My parents and grandparents were born in the same area, and it was called India. And great-grandparents were born in the same place, and it was called Afghanistan. And so for me, the question of the nation state or nationalism has always been a very problematic or contested one. I've never been able to kind of define or understand myself in relationship to the world by national boundaries, right? And so as a result of that, growing up in a family that was also deeply politicized because of our family's work against the British during the formal era of colonialism, that kind of carried over when we were here in Los Angeles. And so growing up in a kind of very politicized household got me to kind of see the world in a particular way, as well as a range of experiences. I guess the equivalent for me growing up, and I'm not trying to equate it, but I'm just saying from my experience, I was a little bit older when 9/11 happened. For me, it was the Iran hostage crisis and kind of the defining moment that created for me as a young person in this country, and my relationship to this place called America, if we're going to call it that. And so, it was that kind of, process of growing up and maturing in political education really got me to really think about things as expansively as possible, but also as comprehensively as possible. And so currently now, it led me to graduate school. I went to film school. I've really been deeply invested in the connection or the relationships between kind of culture and politics, and more specifically militant radical politics. And so a lot of my work is through kind of traditional kind of writing books or curatorial work or film and video work, trying to explore those overlaps and really trying to think about the histories and afterlives, if we want to use that word, of empire, right? And the way in which they persist, because I don't think, even the United States after 9/11, despite the kind of attempts to claim that the US was an empire, there's always been this resistant strain within the US. And I'm not sure that any other countries in Europe would call themselves an empire either. I'm not saying that they're not. I'm just saying they won't formally call themselves that or bask in its glory. But the legacies and afterlives and the durability of the structures that empire created continue to exist. And I think that's what we're contending with here. And so for me to answer that question, there's a lot of ways in. I mean, I think I remember back, what was it, Hamid, and maybe, was it 2014? Where you and me, anonymously at the time, wrote a letter that was, aimed at the Muslim Public Affairs Council, who at the time, on the same day that was a national march for the police killing of Michael Brown, was on that same day, that national day of commemoration, the Muslim Public Affairs Council was honoring Michael Downing, LA police chief, kind of special, what's his position, special police chief or associate police chief or whatever, in charge of security in the war on, essentially he was the liaison between the war on terror and policing. Something that, I've written about in my book, and how William Bratton really made Los Angeles the kind of epicenter for that nexus of war on terror and policing. And we wrote that petition, or that letter calling MPAC out. I think it was called Bowing Down to White Supremacy. And it created quite a stir in terms of the traction it got, the international traction it got. But really what ruffled feathers for MPAC, I think, was the amount and number of the sheer volume of student organizations, which essentially is MPAC's future base, who signed on to that letter. And so it was, I think, an important moment, at least I think, in terms of thinking about the activism that the question that you're posing, Hamid, asks, right, is how do we mobilize against these really violent structural forces, and who and what are the organizations that are, for lack of a better word or phrase, in the way, right? And I think that was not just, that wasn't the reason why I think all the things that Lara is beautifully pointing out in terms of the organizing labor that has gone on for decades, right? That was, I think, a small part, a small pebble in the pond of a larger movement of people who were starting to make these connections in a significant way. And so I start with that, or mention that letter that me and Hamid wrote, and because it had been part of, for me, since 9/11. I remember on 9/11 sitting down with folks here in Los Angeles who became leadership in MPAC, right? That 13 years later, when I was writing that letter, I was essentially writing it to them. And essentially I was saying the same thing to them that I did 13 years before on 9/11/2001, which is, there will come a time when we, if we want to call ourselves we, if there's a collective kind of we will end up being snitches on ourselves, right? We will end up turning our backs on ourselves. Not because I think that's necessarily something endemic to immigrants or endemic to Muslims. That's, from my understanding of history and political organizing in this country, that's the history and legacy of social movements in this country, right? That there's a comprador class that emerges that ultimately seeks to kind of, paint with a broad brush, or you want to call it militant extremist brush, right? Others, as a way of securing positions for itself, or places of power, or access, or proximity to power, I should say. And so, to me, that was just a product of social movement history. And to me, that where that comes out of, and I think it's important, for at least for me to say in the conversation today, is that, I know that, and this gets back to my point about the idea of nationalizing, or in another term, domesticating, right, our understanding of power. We can call the boys in blue, as they are known as, I guess, euphemistically, police, right? And we can call the dudes who wear fatigues the military. To me, they're flip sides of the same coin. To me, the LAPD is the military, and the Marines are the police. If that makes any sense to you. That I don't see a distinction between military and police power. They are two sides of a counterinsurgent coin, right? that seeks to kind of maintain the notion of national security. Now, national security doesn't mean only the United States territorially speaking. It means national security interests around the world. And so for me, it's always been important to understand the notion of how white supremacy works. White supremacy does not have a passport, right? It never has, it never asked for one. It only demanded that we aspire to try to get one. But it itself does not have a passport. And so for me, our understanding of how white supremacy functions shouldn't have one either. We have to think about white supremacy as a global phenomenon, right? And the way in which it continues to structure global relationships and a disproportionate and unequal relationship between countries, right? So that we cannot talk about, for example, the United States and Iran as two countries in a diplomatic row or fight, arguing over an issue about nuclear capability, right? These are not two entities on a level playing field. They are vastly different in terms of the amount of power, diplomatic, political, military, and economic. Even if Iran wanted to, it could not sanction or boycott the United States and prevent the dollar from circulating in the global markets. It cannot do that, even if it wanted to. And for us to even think that Iran could do that is preposterous. It's so absurd to even think that Iran could have that possibility. Yet, the United States can do it at the drop of a hat, right? And so for me, it's important for us to understand that that's a legacy of white supremacy, right? And that when we think about what military or police power, as we're talking about it, is, right, we have to understand it more than simply about guns and killing. Clearly, that's that's the most devastating consequence of it in the immediate. But we have to also understand these structures as encompassing economic power, diplomatic power, political power. What power do police unions hold in terms of the media, in terms of city councils, et cetera? What power, what does the military power produce? It produces and harnesses economic power, diplomatic power at the United Nations, right? Treaty enforcement, corporate power, right? So we have to understand these ideas much more expansively than simply who's carrying a weapon and who's not, or who's killing who, right? We have to understand military and or policing power, whatever word you want to use, much more expansively if we want to try to grapple with how white supremacy operates. And I'll close on this last part, which for me, I think is important to point out, because I think clearly, and this is what, we wrote, Hamid, if you remember, in that letter to MPAC regarding Mike Brown, was that there's a kind of aspirational whiteness that, right, is endemic to how MPAC, right, was presenting itself or understanding itself in relationship to this place called the United States. And so as a result, was buying into and complicit with, right, very violent structures against Black and brown communities, right? And this is something I want to unpack, because I think, I'll come back to that in a second. When we say Muslims, we should not say them as separate. We should not say Muslims and then Black and brown communities. Muslims are Black and brown communities. You know what I mean? They're not separate. Now, are there groups that don't want to see themselves as Black or brown, or just see themselves as human beings? Sure, there's no doubt about that. But Muslims are Black and brown. So when we say Black and brown communities, that's Muslims. And when we say Muslims, that's Black and brown communities, right? It's not totally, not all Black and brown communities are Muslim, but Muslims, for the most part, are Black and brown. And that's important to understand. But the point I was making about aspirational whiteness is MPAC is one organization. And I say this to my students, in talking about, for example, hip hop. I teach a class on hip hop at Irvine. And I said that if Eminem didn't exist, the record industry would have created him. Okay? If MPAC didn't exist, white supremacist institutions would have created an organization like MPAC. Right? And so it's important for us to understand that there will always be an impact, right? As long as or until we abolish the current system. But just like there's always an empath, there will also always be Black and Latinx communities that also claim police accountability, civilian oversight, and they also reinforce and reinscribe the police state, right? And I'm talking about non-Muslim Black and brown communities who will also continue to reaffirm and reinscribe the police state in one form or another, right? So while it is important for us to call out groups like Empath, it's something that I've done and become essentially persona non grata in much of the mainstream Muslim community as a result of it, it's also important for us to understand that there are also non-Muslim Black and Latinx communities or groups that also affirm policing and the larger war on terror architecture, right? So I'll just close on that.
Thank you, Sohail. And obviously, if we go down the list of, as our comrade and dear friend Pete would say, caretakers of white supremacy, man, we'll be here all night long, you know,
Right,
just calling out loud. So while, since, we're on the subject of that, let's talk about Islamophobia and the term Islamophobia itself. I mean, that gets thrown around a lot, that gets is used. So does Islamophobia, just take away the collective impact or the understanding of anti-Muslim racism? And does it sort of sometimes reduce it to more of an interpersonal conflict? And obviously, we talk about hate crimes and we talk about hate speech and various other things. So let's while we're on it, just let's talk about it. So whoever wants to, Sohail, you want to take a dig at that first?
Okay, I don't want to dominate the conversation.
Well, since your mic was off, so I thought I'd ask you.
Okay, all right.
No, it's all good, all good.
No, thank you. I think that's something that I've really been invested in kind of seeking to distinguish or name, right? Islamophobia is a term that I think has gotten a lot of traction. It's become kind of the common term, the lingua franca for understanding what's happening in the war on terror, I guess, if people want to put it that way. It's a recognizable term. But to me, it's profoundly limiting and problematic, right? And Hamid, I think you hit on one aspect of it, right? It's on the one hand, it's a phobia, right? Just like arachnophobia, right? Or germophobia. You're afraid as an individual, you have some sort of psychological issue, right? With spiders or heights, or in this case, Islam, right? So it's something that you as an individual have to get over in the logic of Islamophobia, right? It's some sort of deficiency on your part, right? And so, as Hamid said in his question, it individualizes the problem, right? It doesn't see and it names Islam as the thing to be afraid of. Well, what is Islam? Well, I'm not here to get into like a whole discussion about what that is, but that's a very complicated philosophical question, right? So to say you're afraid of Islam, what is that phobia of Islam? What does that mean? It means to me, I don't know. It's very ambiguous, right? But ultimately it individualizes the problem, right? I'm not here to defend or promote Islam. I'm here to defend Muslims. That's what I see. I'm going to do that, right? You can say what you want about Islam because you probably don't even know what it is. I'm here to defend Muslims. And so for me, when we talk about Islamophobia, it individualizes the problem. It personalizes it as some sort of mental deficiency, right? That someone needs to go seek counseling or therapy for. Or in the language of kind of colorblindness, go talk to a Muslim, get to know one. Or go pick up a Quran at Barnes and Noble or whatever and read it, and you'll be less Islamophobic, I guess, right? Like that's the idea. And what I've been really invested in is trying to think about how it's really anti-Muslim racism that's the driver here. It's white supremacy, right? And this has a deep history. And it's something that I and many others have written about, right? So, I mean, if you really think about, I'll try to say this as really quickly as possible. If you think about the origins of the modern concept of race, right? How race is tied to nationhood and the idea of white supremacy. We all think about it, and it's It's the demented nursery rhyme we all learned in school. 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? Well, what happened in 1492? 1492, just as fast forward, was the year that Spain expelled the Moors and the Jews from Europe, right? And then Columbus sails and discovers the quote unquote new world, discovers it, right? Supposedly. And so it's important to understand that the very idea of race, right? That is to say, who is white or Christian and who is not, who is European and Christian and who is not, emerges out of an encounter with the Moor, with the Muslim, right? So that the flip side to the white Christian is the Black Moor, the Black Muslim, right? That's the opposite of it. That's what it defined itself against. So much so, and you can read this in different diaries and travel logs, and that when the Spanish were first in the quote unquote new world and they encountered the indigenous people here, they referred to them as Moriscos, as Moors. They saw them as these heathen, savage people who were outside the fold of what they considered to be the human, and they saw them as Muslims, right? So I say all that to say that at the core of our understanding of race, at the very core of our understanding of what is white, right, is the figure of the Muslim. It's in it. So that Muslim is deeply structured within should be in our deeply embedded within our understanding of what is race, right? And so as a result of that, then came a whole architecture philosophically and politically and militarily about then how white supremacy was going to see different parts of the world and different groups of people. And of course, then Muslims and the Orient, as Edward Said did in Orientalism, kind of names that, right? And so to me, anti-Muslim racism is the more appropriate term for thinking about the ways in which state violence targets those they deem Muslim. Remember, the first person killed after 9/11 was a Sikh man in Arizona, right? He was Sikh, he was wearing a turban, and they thought he was Muslim because he looked the part, right? And so it's anti-Muslim racism is a term that I think is more appropriate for thinking about how white supremacy as a structure operates. I hope that's clear to folks.
Thank you for that. Lara, moving on to you. Any thoughts on that?
It's an
And how has it played out in your organizing as well?
Yeah, I think early on, many of us had that same response to Islamophobia because even by definition, it's about interpersonal fears of the other, right? I do think it's about how it's used. The utility of the term is, I think it really depends on who's using it and how and when. And over time, like Sohail was saying, it has become a commonly understood term to the average person, right? You hear Islamophobia, it's something bad and it's anti-Muslim. It may not lend itself towards automatically understanding a critique of race and power or structures of race and power, but at the end of the day, it does have an opening for a wider audience. And as someone who does base building, I think that's quite important, right? We want to meet people where they're at. That being said, there's also ways we've done that, like in campaign work we've done around the erasure of Palestine and Arab American studies from ethnic studies in California, for instance. We named what the California Department of Education was doing as Islamophobic. And they got very reactive. I mean, calling someone Islamophobic is like the last thing they want to hear. And so they felt immediately they responded and reacted to that. And had to get on the defensive, right? And so oftentimes we want our opposition to be on the defensive. That means we're doing something right. And in that case, I think it was interesting to see how far it moved people, but also by naming these Zionist forces who are behind the attack on Palestine and Arab American studies, including legislators and the Jewish Democratic Caucus, at the end of the day, they are Islamophobic. And by saying that, it helps people understand Zionism differently. It helps them understand racism differently, especially for those who don't come from a clear understanding or critique of those things, right? So I think there's some utility in it. That being said, we've also seen it used against us time and time and time again, where the mouthpieces on Islamophobia are some of the most racist, Zionist, liberals who end up actually reinforcing the systems we're trying to overturn, right? So in the same case of ethnic studies, they brought in a mouthpiece of an Islamic organization, Islamic network. What is it called? Islamic, you know what I'm talking about, Akil. So ING, and they brought in the leader of ING, Mahal Ginti, to actually replace any critique Arabs and Muslims, thank you, Islamic Network, any critique that Arabs, Muslim, but other also Black and brown folks were making of this ethnic studies attack and the erasure of Palestine and Arab American studies and the gutting of any liberatory or anti-colonial analysis or pedagogy in the curriculum in California. So this was a 3-year battle that we inserted ourselves as the reference points, right? A broad spectrum of Black and brown scholars, experts, community organizers. And at the very end, on the 11th hour, once all the writers said, we disavow this curriculum, it doesn't represent ethnic studies, they brought mouthpieces of all the 4 food groups, right? The different communities that supposedly ethnic studies represents, to then say, we are going to give an okay to this curriculum as an Arab or Muslim. In this case, ING said, we are supporting this curriculum. And suddenly this curriculum became acceptable because she's a reference point for on anti-Islamophobia work, right? So there's ways in which it can be used against us, especially because it's such a broad term, it's such a broad concept that allows anyone to use it and call themselves anti-racist, right? But at the end of the day, Islamophobia in of itself is limited, but I think it has to do with how you use it, who uses it, and when. We want to also be strategic around how we use language. It's actually quite important, right? And I think there's ways in which we can do that well as movements to not just disavow Islamophobia as a concept altogether. I think there's a lot of scholarship on why we should and how, but as organizers, we may want to rethink ways to use these words and language as tools to organize people, to build masses, to actually meet people where they're at, and then bring them to the conversation around Zionism, racism, anti-colonialism. That's how we did it, at least with the ethnic studies work, and we built a whole movement around it. Because there's no way to understand what Zionists are doing as anything other than racist. But if people don't really get that, you can say it's Islamophobic, and it's clear that it's Islamophobic because they erase any mention of Arabs, Palestinians, or Muslims from the curriculum, right? So there's ways in which you can start to use that language to actually move people. And I think I would want to just look at that as an opening. However, there's also obviously limitations to it if it's only used by people who are reactionary or liberal or normalizing the systems we're trying to overturn.
Thank you, Lara. Appreciate you both. So before I pass it on to Akil, I just wanted to see if any other folks have any comments or questions to what you've heard, either from Sohail or Lara. Dun, 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 dun. All right. Okay, cool. So let me just pass it on to Akil.
Hi, everyone. I'm Akil from Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. So we have a few more questions before we open it up for a Q&A. This one's originally for Sohail, but Lara, if you want to jump into it, would be more than welcome. So Sohail, you marked the inauguration of Obama in 2009 as a key moment, and you described this moment where Dianne Feinstein references Malcolm X to rebuke him and kind of like offer a whitewashed memory of Martin Luther King. Can you talk a little bit about the significance of that moment and then kind of connected to this present moment and maybe the inauguration of Biden following the mob attack on the Capitol and this sort of current phase of the war on terror that has marked, and kind of what is your analysis of that phase of the war on terror that we are entering, where we see, for example, the federal government trying to expand its counterterrorism infrastructure under the guise of targeting domestic terrorists, which they're trying to imply as white supremacists, but we know who they're going to really go after. So anyway, how would you analyze this present moment and then connect it to your sharp analysis of 2009?
I appreciate that question, Akil. You were going way back. actually read the book, or at least the beginning of it. Yeah, I think, you know, for me, I mean, Obama was, you know, important for a lot of reasons. And I think what I was trying to point out there was, you know, how even surrounding Obama, the specter of him as a Muslim, you know, for those of us who are young enough to remember, one of the turning points in the campaign in 2008 between him and John McCain was when John McCain was holding a town hall meeting as a nominee of the Republican Party between him and Obama, and a woman said, you know, she raised her hand and she asked McCain a question, and I think I'm paraphrasing here, but she basically asked, she says, "What do you think about Obama? He you know, I don't trust him. He's a Muslim, right? Oh no, I don't think he's a family man. He's an Arab. He's a Muslim." And McCain, you know, said something to the effect of, no, he's not, meaning Arab or Muslim. He's a good person, right? As if being Arab or Muslim was exclusive to being a good person, but whatever. Point I'm raising is that there was this whole specter, and, you know, there was the Atlantic Monthly cover of Obama and Michelle at the time in the White House, in the Oval Office. This had come out, like, it was almost like this is who they were behind the scenes. And he was dressed in like a galabea and wearing like chappals or ship. And, you know, on the Oval Office mantelpiece was a picture of Osama bin Laden, and burning in the fireplace was an American flag. Michelle had a kind of stereotypical, you know, blowout fro with bullets across her chest, like the Angela Davis iconography almost. And it was suggesting that this is who they were. Sorry, it was a New Yorker, I believe. This is who they were behind the scenes. So anyway, there was this whole, and his middle name was Hussein, right? All this stuff. And so what I was pointing out in that was that even on his inauguration, you know, Malcolm X was invoked. Because as I argued in the book, that this fear of Blackness and Islam was really a deeper fear about Malcolm X in the country and what those two things meant to American national identity. And so it's just ironic. I remember watching Feinstein introducing Obama, and she, without saying his name, invokes Malcolm X and his Ballad of the Bullet speech, right? And whitewashes, as you rightly point out, Akil, Dr. King, right? Not the militant King of why he was killed. And so I think like that to me was also a signal moment that really served to kind of wed and, you know, this notion that Blackness and Americanness have a common destiny, right? That was the idea that America's destiny is Black people's destiny, right? And so I think as a result of how that played out, right? Obviously, this is post Bush and Cheney and what they had done. And so Obama was kind of seen as kind of like a conciliatory. It was kind of like America's righting itself, righting the ship, so to speak, right? First Black president, et cetera, et cetera. But really what it did, as we know now, is it really deepened the war on terror, right? Obama just shifted method and became even more kind of insidious in terms of like the ways the war was prosecuted and executed. The emergence of countering violent extremism programs under Obama, right? Muslims are our partners in the fight against extremism, and the shift toward drone warfare, right? So as a result of that, terrorism, the threat of terrorism took on a different tone or tenor. And I did an interview in The Nation in 2013. I was supposed to do a book launch event for that book that you're reading from, Akil, and it was canceled. And it was a host of grassroots left organizing groups in New York who I have a deep, deep, deep respect for, right? But the Boston Marathon bombing had just happened. And as a result of that, literally it happened the day before, 2 days before my book launch was supposed to happen in the Riverside Church, ironically, where Dr. King gave that Beyond Vietnam speech. And these leftist organizations were feeling the pressure and decided that they were going to cancel the event. And of course, I was disappointed, blah, blah, blah. But I ended up doing an interview in The Nation about it, and recognizing the position that they were in, but also talking about the impact that this is having on grassroots orgs, the war on terror is having on grassroots orgs and Black POC organizations, and the position it's putting us in. And in that piece, I talked about how the idea of counterterrorism or anti-terrorism, right, is really, right, terrorism is really a dog whistle term for race, right? It's a dog whistle term for savagery, the savage, right? The civilization savagery binary for the human, the non-human. And so what I was arguing was that mainstream Muslim organizations are buying into the idea of counterterrorism, as is mainstream Black and Brown, Latinx communities, and of course, white America is too. And I use the metaphor of a dog chasing its tail, that you're if you understand how white supremacy and profiling works, right? If they're going to find the few bad apples, right? That's what Muslim communities always say. Oh, that happened and it's not us. That's just a few extremists. Well, in order to find a few bad apples, they have to target the whole community, right? In order to find that. So you were reinvigorating the very thing you claim to be trying to stop, right? You were reinvigorating white supremacy. And the example I pointed out was what happens when the Boston bombers were, for all intents and purposes, white, right? But you weren't seeing a wholesale racial profiling of white communities, right? And so when you fast forward then to January 6th, to me, this is the logical outcome of that, right? There's almost like, and you still see it, like, that there's almost like Muslims want to say, see, white people can be terrorists too. And Muslim allies of Muslims, Black and Brown communities will say, see, white people are terrorists too. But ultimately what we're doing is normalizing the idea that terror is something that exists, right? And we know, or at least we should know, that when it gets monitored or surveilled, it's gonna, that category of who a terrorist is going to disproportionately impact Black and Brown communities. Just like during a previous era, during the so-called war on crime, crime exists, whatever you want to say crime is. And of course, white collar crime gets excluded from that category, but crime, but who was disproportionately targeted? Black and Brown communities, overwhelmingly. So to me, the language of terrorism is like the language of crime or illegal in terms of immigration, right? It's a dog whistle term for race. And ultimately what we're doing after like January 6th is by saying, hey, these white people are terrorists too, right? All we're asking for is an emboldening of the counter-terrorist state, the national security state, right? We're not undermining it or undercutting it. We're emboldening it by embracing the idea that, hey, these guys are terrorists, right? And it raises the question, well, Sohail, if they're not terrorists, what are they? How do we talk about this? Well, again, the idea is that terrorism is somehow separate from state power, right? And I don't see these guys as acting as separate from state power. They are an extension of state power, sometimes directly, but if not directly, indirectly, right? They're doing the labor of the white supremacist state. And so we have to come up with a different language in some ways to talk about how we deal with whiteness. To me, and again, this is a post-Trump thing, and I'll close on this, white supremacy has become a very common term, right? White supremacy is seen as the problem, but we're not understanding whiteness as the problem, right? It's not white supremacy that's the problem, it's whiteness that's the problem. And I think that's a fundamental shift that we have to make, in my mind, in terms of thinking about how we target these forces. It's whiteness is terrorism. If you have whiteness, you're going to have white supremacy in the current configuration of how institutions operate. You can't separate the two. They're interchangeable. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And Lara, would you like to, I mean, either from your organizing experience or how you understand these things, analytically, how would you kind of compare the era of the war on terror that we're in right now and analyze it compared to what we've seen under previous administrations, especially in the wake of the attack on the Capitol?
And I think again, it's about U.S. war making, U.S. imperialism, both abroad and here, right? As we've been mentioning a few times during the course of this conversation, you can and shouldn't separate out the two things, although many do. And so, the war on isn't separate from the war on drugs, isn't separate from the Cold War, isn't separate from the war in Korea, Vietnam. There's at the end of the day, it's all very much part of the political and economic priorities of this country as a capitalist country, an imperialist country. And so you can't separate it out and you shouldn't separate it out. And by doing so, I think having that understanding, it helps us all do our work better, because then we see ourselves as part of something much bigger, but also it helps us understand the everyday lived experience of people differently. I think one thing that is necessary for all our work, whether we're talking about language as it relates to the word terror or terrorism, language as it relates to Islamophobia, and trying to differentiate and distinguish between structures of harm, systems of oppression, and interpersonal violence and such, is there needs to be a class analysis, right? So usually those who are advancing these ideas that these things are separate or compartmentalized, or that they are voicing them, or they're presenting themselves as experts and reference points on issues that are void of any structural analysis, more often than not, there's a problem with their lack of class analysis or their class positionality, right? And if we all do better in terms of incorporating that in how we do our work and how we think about our work, who we're organizing and how we're organizing, it makes it almost impossible for us not to have an internationalist, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, anti-racist agenda and political program. What happens is we get sucked into these silos, and especially with the influx of like the nonprofits and the ways in which we've been organized within our different sectors, versus understanding ourselves as much bigger, right? And lastly, just around this war period, what war also does is it criminalizes solidarity. So the war on terror included, but all wars preceding it and every administration preceding it made it so that we don't have a real internationalist movement, that it's hard to build third world solidarity, that even sending money, remittances to your family is considered material support of terrorism now, right? So we can't even be in community with our own family members, let alone build solidarity with people internationally. That becomes criminal because we're all at the receiving end of this war, and everyone who's engaging in solidarity work is seen as the enemy within or the enemy without. And so we have to start to also complicate that. But I think without a class analysis, that's going to be almost impossible. And I think folks who have really good class analysis can use these terms in ways that move people and build power and shift power, but more importantly, can also advance a leftist analysis that's rooted in internationalist politics, which is one of the key things missing today. And given that we can learn so much from movements abroad, because really they are the ones leading the struggle against US imperialism and at the front lines of this COVID pandemic and the global implications of it. And in some cases, teaching us how to do better around public health, right, in this country. There's so much to be learned. And I think the more we can step outside of our silos and also start to really understand ourselves as part of a working class community internationally, there's a lot of possibility there, both in terms of analysis and organizing, movement building, and the ability to actually build some power in the places that need it.
Thank you, Lara. We have one more question, and then we're going to go to a Q&A, a brief Q&A. And first, for Lara, although there's a spin of this question for you too, Sohail, if you're down to answer. But Lara, could you talk a little bit about the centrality of Zionism to the war on terror? And how did you were talking about the Palestinian community, both in Palestine and in diaspora, being used as a laboratory for the development of these tactics as well as ideologies pre 9/11. And maybe you could, if you are down to speak a little bit about this too, how did Zionism itself shift in terms of its, I guess, like its language that it's used with the advent of the war on terror, as opposed to the way it targeted the Palestinian resistance previously to that? So kind of how is 9/11 an inflection point, and how is Zionism central to basically what has happened since too?
You know, in the early 2000s, it was really easy for our communities to understand slogans around anti-war would have to include Free Palestine, right? So as soon as the US began to wage its wars on Afghanistan and Iraq, we were like, okay, here the US goes again, because the settler colonial project of Israel is a partner of the United States and a tool of US imperialism. There's no other way to understand it, right? I mean, $3.8 billion a year is what makes possible the occupation of Palestine. And it's a mutually beneficial relationship. It's not one way or the other, right? So there's ways in which the United States benefits from using Palestine as a laboratory terrain for surveillance technology and weaponry, and Israel benefits from getting that money to create those weapons or purchasing those weapons from the US to use on us, right? And it was really, really difficult to make the case with others because they were there was, I think, just a sense of a lacking of analysis of US imperialism, which still a lacking of analysis of US imperialism, what it is, how it functions, and who are its proxies and other states that are its functionaries, like the state of Israel, like Arab regimes included, right? And that was lacking. And I think for us as Arabs and Palestinians, it's very clear there's a settler colony in our region. We can't talk about war without talking about the settler colony, which made way for wars. But also Israel played a very particular role in the war on terror. I mean, United States used Israel's framework for how it related to Palestinian resistance in many ways to deal with how they also related to Arabs and Palestinians in our region, right? And Arabs and Muslims in our region. There was a playbook, both how Israel used the United States settler colony of this land on North America as a playbook for its colonization of Palestine, but the United States was also using Israel's tactics and technologies to be able to use against us in this quote unquote war on terror against the Arab or Muslim terrorists, right? And this is clear, and also the one country that continues to block any attempt to end the blockade on Cuba, to continue to support dictatorships in our region, to want to wage war on Iran, right, is the state of Israel. It's the Israel and the United States, and there's a direct relationship there. So for us, it's not separate. It's all part of it. And Israel, you can't talk about the war on terror without talking about apartheid Israel, both in our region and its relationship globally. I mean, they began to develop more technology, surveillance, and weaponry after 9/11 than they had previously, and profited from it, but also other repressive regimes benefited from it as they exploited other working class Black and brown people globally. So there's those direct connections. In terms of how Israel shifted post 9/11, I don't know if we make that assessment that there was a particular shift post 9/11, but it emboldened Israel, right? I mean, 9/11 emboldened the attack on Palestinian resistance. 9/11 happened 1 year after the 2000 Intifada. So there was an Intifada, an uprising in Palestine in 2000, where there was mass resistance and a new sort of development and widening of political activity as it related to Palestinian solidarity. We started Students for Justice in Palestine. Solidarity activity started to take place all across the world in solidarity with Palestine and Palestinian resistance. And 9/11 was used as a way to further criminalize Palestinian resistance in Palestine, but also in diaspora, right? So here in the United States, Palestinian resistance has historically been targeted and used as an example, like LA 8, Los Angeles 8, which was a case study that 9/11 then emboldened and built a lot of policies based on what they were able to accomplish or not accomplish with the case of the Los Angeles 8. The 7 Palestinians and 1 Kenyan were targeted by the United States federal government. All of them were immigrants. And it was a 20-odd year case, and they ended up winning. But the 20 years of surveillance and terror that the United States inflicted on our people really was used as a testing ground. So that continues. I mean, I was surveilled and targeted by the FBI in 2001. I recall because I was organizing on campus around Palestine. At that time, I didn't even quite understand the surveillance in the way that I do today, or how this works, or why I was being targeted. But Palestine has always been a focal point in terms of criminalization of resistance, because there's an ongoing anti-colonial fight there. It also provides an opening for anti-colonialism in our region, and because of the US-Israeli partnership, right? So we can't dismiss Israel outside of this equation. Just like you can't dismiss imperialism, you can't talk about the war on terror without talking about US imperialism. You cannot talk about US imperialism without talking about the apartheid state of Israel. And so if we understand it as such, it helps us do our work better here, especially if we're trying to organize. Because if you're going to do the real work of organizing against surveillance and policing and militarization, Israel has a hand in that, obviously, but you're going up against Zionism, you're going against the police state, you're going up against US imperialism. I mean, these are not projects and systems that are easy to dismantle. And politically, we don't have that type of political power. We have the people power. But in order to do that work well, we have to be prepared and organize ourselves so we understand our conditions very clearly, that when you take up these issues, you're going to face Zionist backlash. You're going to face attacks by the right wing. You're going to face attack. You're going to be targeted by the state. How to defend against that is to be prepared for it. As we always say, like, be prepared, not paranoid, right? And to do our organizing well, we have to have that analysis. Otherwise, you're going to be blindsided. Because when you do the good work, you're going to get targeted. And when you do the good work, you're going to be targeted by those in power. And when you do the good work, you have to be prepared to defend against those attacks. And I think that's one place that the movement has some more work to do around understanding how Zionism and white supremacy, Zionism and racist institutions, Zionism and US imperialism cannot be decoupled. And we have to do better work at understanding that. So when we do our work, we do it better and deeper and actually advance a real political project towards shifting the economic and political priorities of this country and globally.
Thank you, Lara. And just for the sake of time, because I know some people in the audience have questions, Sohail, is it okay if we jump to the Q&A at this point? Yeah. Thank you so much for both of you for answering so many of the questions in such great depth. Okay, so we're opening it up now. Hamid, should we enable people to unmute, or should we allow?
Yeah, people can unmute anytime they want to. So, or maybe post a question in chat, or just there's a raise your hand function as well. So let's dive right in. Anybody has any questions? Shakir, did you have a question?
Yeah, how did you know?
You were kind of just. Anyways, go ahead.
Well, yeah, thank you, Lara and Sohail, for everything you're sharing, and also thank you to our ASL interpreters for being with us this whole time. And yeah, so the question I was thinking about is sort of related to what Sohail is saying about thinking about kind of global anti-imperialist solidarity, and also what Lara was saying about kind of lessons that our movements have learned about new forms of solidarity and affinity in the last couple decades. What I want to ask about is thinking about settler colonialism and thinking about, that in a sense, those of us who are from like diasporic communities and my family's from Bangladesh and my parents came to the United States, is we're in a sense settlers too, or part of a settler colonial system, and your political orientation towards that system maybe determines like, how much of a settler you are or whatever. I don't know, but the question is, I guess, just thinking about, like what does that kind of solidarity look like, and what that, how that's changed over time. I know in Palestinian liberation movement work, there's been kind of a more deliberate naming of Israeli, of the Zionist state as settler colonial. And so that's, maybe one place that solidarity shows up, but just even, thinking about the role of kind of immigrant communities in the US. I mean, obviously a lot of us are fleeing the effects of colonization and imperialism wherever we're coming from, or our parents are coming from, but just kind of connecting our identities here to settler colonialism. Either of you, any thoughts on that?
Laura, do you want to go? Okay. No, that's a great question, Shakir. I think for me, thinking about, again, these systems and how they work transnationally or non-nationally is really important. I think, like many of you all, my family migrated from somewhere else, right? And it's something that, I think I try to point out in different spaces is, oftentimes the narrative, and it affirms a very kind of, triumphalist, American narrative that our parents came to the land of opportunity, right? I mean, that's the typical way in which it's framed. And I say, okay, let's assume that's true for a second. It's a big assumption, but let's assume that's true for a second. Why is it that the United States has more opportunity than, say, Ecuador or Bangladesh or Senegal or Kenya or Pakistan or Egypt? Why does the United States have more opportunity than those places, right? Is that because those places are just inherently backward? They don't know how to build societies. They don't know how to provide opportunities. They don't care about those things. They just enjoy living in squalor and poverty, and right? Like, clearly we know the answer to that question, right? They don't enjoy it. It's not a natural thing that the United States is the land of opportunity, or that Europe is another space, if you will, broadly defined, Western Europe in particular, of opportunity. That it was made to be that way, right? Through a whole history of intervention, both military, economic, and political and diplomatic working, right? To create the conditions, right? And the wealth redistribution to the global north that made Europe and the United States lands of opportunity, right? And so for me, then it's important then to understand that our migration here, and I think this often gets lost on some of our, if not many of our, but regardless, too many of our immigrant communities, is we don't see our migration here as a product of white supremacy. We don't. We just see it as, hey, we just got to go from one place to another, and that place, the United States, is better, and we're here. So for a lot of my students and folks, they don't understand their place or their parents' place here as being a product of white supremacy. They just understand it as, I'm an immigrant and I'm hustling and I'm going to do well. And if I could do well and my parents can make it, then what's wrong with all the other people here who can't make it, right? They don't understand their relationship to white supremacy, right? They don't understand how their actual lives and beings were structured and formed and shaped by it. So I think that's really important for me, right? Is kind of trying to convey that to folks, that white supremacy structures our migration. It's the rationale, it's the reason for, it's the conduit, however you want to use and talk about it, right? And if we can grapple with that and accept that, then that will recalibrate us to then being in the United States, right? And what it means to be here. If we see ourselves as being shaped by white supremacy, not just getting here, but also while we're here, right? Then that should then become a moment of kind of political education, opening toward a different kind of way of being and thinking about then other communities who have not the same, but different relationships to white supremacy and violence, right? And so for me, I think that becomes like a foundation for a particular kind of solidarity. I think, for me, it's also, I have to think about what does it mean, because, and as a result of coming here, and for some of us forced to come here, escaping, as a result then, based on the survival modes that we're put in, we make, or our parents make some what we might call problematic decisions, right? They may want to be the good citizen. They want to aspire to whiteness. They don't want to rock the boat. Also because they probably came from places where when they rocked the boat, they got threatened or killed. And so they were just like, let's keep it, right? And so as a result of that whole process, they make some decisions that are based on survival and necessity that we can now look back on and pick apart potentially, or look at now and pick apart, right? And to me, that's similar, not the same, but to the ways in which Black and Latinx communities have to make deliberations when they join the military. Right? It's not their fault that the schools that they go to are underfunded and don't have the proper kinds of education that's just and equitable and fair. It's not their fault. Or that the opportunities based on the neighborhoods that they live in don't provide for X, Y, and Z things. So as a result, they make some fraught decisions. And they end up picking up a gun for Uncle Sam and oftentimes pointing it at people who look like them, or at the very least us, right? And so I feel like we have to have a kind of more comprehensive understanding of, again, how white supremacy is operating, right? And so I think then the question of, are we settlers here or not? I'm not sure I can answer that question in the affirmative. Are there ways that we participate in a settler logic? Yes, but I think a lot of people are. Probably everybody in this country is. Is it all the same? No, right? But I'm not sure that that's necessarily, to me, the most productive, regenerative way of approaching this, right? It's about thinking about how we're all in some ways differentially or differently situated within these systems. And we make fraught, troubling, problematic decisions as a result, and choices, right? Because I think this is something that, you know, I think is important to convey is like, you know, I don't think that we've really, that a lot of people, I'm not saying we in this room here on Zoom, but I don't think a lot of us, even from our communities, diaspora communities from, call us Middle East, South Asia, or that, whatever term you want to use, I don't think we fully grapple with, let alone mainstream white American society, and maybe other Black and brown communities as well, but I don't think we fully grapple with how violent and destructive US militarism is. I don't think we really grapple with that, and how it does it with impunity, right? And if the soldiers there can come back here and get housing loans, education loans, and you know, they get to board the airplane first, and you know what I mean, that's a kind of a joke, but you know, they get all kinds of benefits, right? And they get medals for the work that they do, and the deaths that they create are just rendered invisible, and the devastation that they create are rendered invisible. I think Laura pointed it out. Oh, the US war in Afghanistan is over. Really? Like, we're not going to talk about the special forces and drones that are still operating. Let's forget about that. What about the economic structure and infrastructure that's been created there, that's manifested in abject poverty for generations to come? Like, to me, that's a reflection of militarism. And we don't really reckon with that devastation here. And I would argue that even some so-called leftists don't. They just pass it off as, yes, military power. And then they want to vote. And then, you know, policing here, what is that? Is it just number of deaths of people at the hands of a police officer? No. Is it just surveillance? No. Policing is the tip of the spear, right? There's a whole system of economic devastation that goes down in communities that policing is just there to manage, right? And that's also, to me, part of how we have to think about these systems, right? It's much more comprehensively. And so for me, I think like it's important to put those things in perspective, you know? I mean, the United States has 800 military bases around the world. You know, one of my favorite hip hop groups is Gangstar. They have a song called Suckers Need Bodyguards. You know what I mean? Like, if you were really the beacon of truth and justice, why do you need so many guns to prove it to people? Right? 800 military. The United States is the biggest military spender in the world, outbuying the next 10 countries combined. 53 cents of every tax dollar automatically goes to the Pentagon, unquestioned. Automatically. No one bats an eye. Right? The United States, for its 245-year history, and has been at war 225 of those years. And of course, it takes war to maintain this place as a settler colony too. So it's pretty much been at war its whole existence. So warfare is what it knows. And I think we have to really grapple with what that means in the positions it puts people in. I'm not trying to excuse people's choices and behaviors necessarily, but maybe I'm trying to explain them at least, you know what I mean? And I think that's really important for me. Anyway, I'll stop.
Laura, any thoughts on that? I know we have promised to get you all out by 7:15 or so, so we're holding you a little longer because thanks for the conversation, but any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I would just one thing to add, and echoing everything Sohail said, that, at the end of the day, also Indigenous water protectors are teaching us how to be in solidarity against settler colonialism. So, we can interrogate what it means to be a settler on this land all day, every day, but what it really means to be in solidarity with the people who were colonized is where I think we should be putting our energies. And in many cases, they've given us plenty of opportunities, like Line 3, like Standing Rock, and others who've really given us avenues to be in direct solidarity with our Indigenous siblings. And I think that's where I learned from what's needed as somebody who's been, my family's been forcibly displaced from Palestine as refugees. But that being said, we're all part of the settler colonial state in some way, shape, or form. And our duty is to then give back in ways that our comrades are asking us to. And in this case, I think we are quite lucky to have, and it's inspiring to see the ongoing resistance to settler colonialism here from our Indigenous siblings, and so much to learn from. And I know for us as Palestinians, settler colonialism is very close to our lived experience. So we have an analysis of it that's quite embodied in us. And we learn so much from our Native siblings here in the US, and there's a lot of opportunity for us to act in solidarity these days.
Awesome. Anybody else has any pressing question or a burning desire to make a comment on what we have heard? Great. Well, I want to thank you both very much, and you're more than welcome to stay. And this has been a powerful conversation. This has been an inspiring conversation. And I think, and what I've really appreciated about the conversation is that this is about collective learning. It's about collective unpacking. It's about building that collective power by engaging in these critical conversations, and which are self-reflective, critical, but also not just kind of bringing us down, but moving forward, building that power that, how are we, in a sense, as we say here, one which you lifted, Lara, that we're here to build power, not paranoia. But it's also critical for us to know our fight, that, how our fight is the complexities of that fight, and how many different levels we have to really keep engaged and keep on supporting each other. So, and again, I can't thank enough our interpreters, which are just doing some tremendous job in supporting us. So next we're going to be talking about that we are releasing a zine today on the Los Angeles Police Departments. And as you all may know, or who are not in LA, that, just LA has one of the largest unhoused communities in the United States. And, being in Skid Row and situated in Skid Row, we see that all the time. And the response of the city has been, as it always has responded, like, just by organized abandonment, by organized neglect, by engaging in police violence, by engaging in various types of white supremacist operations and all of that. So we are releasing a zine on a report that the Los Angeles Police Department just released back in August on their removal of unhoused communities from Echo Park. So I'm going to pass it on to Nina, and this is in partnership with LA Can and Street Watch LA. So Nina, please take it from there. And let me just make sure that you have the co-host. Yes, there you are. Go ahead, Nina.
Cool. Thanks, Ahmed. Hey, y'all. My name's Nee. I use she, her, aya pronouns. And I'm going to screen share a little bit real quick the zine that we've been working on in collaboration with our partners, LA Can, as well as Street Watch LA. We just released it earlier today, or we just put it on the website earlier today. So we wanted to give y'all a kind of a first look into the zine. Can folks see my screen okay? Cool. So you can access the zine on the stoplapdspying.org website. It's under the zine tabs. And it's the blueprint for displacement. So it's a breakdown of LAPD's after action report. And if you scroll at the bottom, it'll show you the online and the printable PDF version. So if you would want to print it out, you can also have access to that as well. And yeah, so we wrote this in response to LAPD's after action report, specifically the Echo Park Rehabilitation After Action report that they released in August of this year. And it's essentially, it was a year-long campaign that LAPD organized in collaboration with several city entities to surveil, banish, and then evict the communities that, or the community that was creating or kind of centering their needs as well. And so we'll talk a little bit about some of the conversations, and we also did it in collaboration as well with UTAC. So it's the Unhoused Tenants Against Carceral Housing. But it's just a breakdown of what LAPD's report is, what the harm is, not only about the report, but the actions and the year-long campaign, how, and then it goes into more concrete information about how the supposed housing offers that were kind of given to folks, which aren't really, they're not housing opportunities for folks or things that center the community's needs, but rather used as a checklist to be like, oh, they're not, they're refusing our services, even though their services are carceral, their services don't require, don't really center the safety of folks, and are just utilized as a PR effort or way of creating a dangerous narrative. And then also keep in mind that LAPD has, I believe, is it over 40 employees that they have specifically to work on these PR campaigns. And so we thought it was really important to kind of recenter what was going on in Echo Park and kind of ground it in that struggle for permanent housing, as well as for more supportive infrastructure. So I'm just gonna go through it really quick. But if folks do have any questions, we will be continuing to have different workshops as well as different webinars to kind of talk a little bit more in depth about the Echo Park zine. But it just has a little breakdown. So the collaborators include several different entities, including City Council, or the Council District 13, LA Homeless Service Authorities, LA Sanitation, Fire Department, and various other entities. And it's not surprising that surveillance and the increased police surveillance, enforcement, and engagement dramatically increased with the Black leadership and folks in the Echo Park Lake residents. And it started off with increased patrols, but also with pigs going and trying to show up with pizzas, but specifically through a lens of outreach for removal. And so they talk a little bit about how they were trying to do outreach. They were trying to, and it was like the last effort, but the evictions was directly part of that process, and it was one of the last steps, but it was a crucial step to that. And so when they talk about outreach that they're doing, it is outreach for removal. It's outreach to collect data, to then utilize that data to justify their actions and to justify the evictions and the banishment of folks. So it just goes a little bit into, so from conversations that we have with folks, the city offerings were congregate shelters, Project Room Key, and parking lots, which will go into like nonprofits as well that also benefit from these partnerships, and how nonprofits as well have been deputized to collect this data that gets used by LAPD to justify that and to write it into the report. And it goes into the breakdown a little bit about how much was wasted. So just for the 3-day raid itself, $2 million was utilized for just salaries, police salaries, and overtime pay. Of the $735,000 that the city claimed went on repairs, it ended up $250,000 ended up going to CCTV cameras and $104,000 to install fences. And that doesn't even include the entire system and the amount of money that goes into tax expenditures and other city agencies as well. Right after the eviction, you can see here the cops in their private park, which after they erected the fences, ended up using the swan boats as folks were being evicted, as they had an open, as they had folks trapped inside without knowing what was going on. And so it also contradicts the fact that LA or Los Angeles Homeless Service Authority also recognized that the reason for the increased unhoused population is also directly tied to housing affordability, housing availability, and income inequality. But also recognizing that Caltrans, which is a city organization or city a government agency, a state agency that has currently hundreds of homes, not only in El Sereno, but in Pasadena as well. So the same folks that are causing the crisis, the housing crisis, are in turn being utilized to evict folks and then justify the evictions. And then we go into the breakdown. So the specific police programs that go into that went into specifically the eviction. And so Sarah, which has been around for years, was utilized and deployed in this case to, SARO stands for Scanning, Analysis, Response, and Assessment, to specifically gather that information, to monitor conversations about social media, the monitoring of social media specifically, and utilizing that both in real time as well as just doing that research to not only flag events, but also to bring in other law enforcement agencies when other actions are happening. And then just centering it that it's not a moment in time, but it's a continuation of history. The March raid in Echo Park wasn't the first time that this city or Los Angeles, or so-called Los Angeles, because also recognizing that we are on stolen Tongva territory, it's important to reference and to know that while these evictions are taking place, it comes from a larger history of the United Settler States continuing to do this to communities and to banish communities. And then we have more of our information in our bibliographies if folks would want to take a look at things. But something that we are going to be doing in the future is Watch the Watchers. So we do have a piece here where we are asking for folks or for communities support and help with identifying the 33 CCTV cameras that were installed in Echo Park. And then at the end, you'll just see the handle also of the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, LA CAN, as well as Street Watch. I'll go ahead and link the website as well. So if folks would want to either get to read the zine online or would want to print out their own version, you'd be able to have access to both of them. And then if you would want to plug in, or if you would be interested in kind of the conversations about it, we will be posting it on our social media as well as a website whenever we do have those follow-up steps, as well as the Watch the Watchers event, where we will be identifying the different CCTV cameras that exist and are currently being utilized to surveil. And the CCTV cameras, it does also, it's a feed that goes into LAPD that gets analyzed as well, which is really important to, as we're talking about the police state, to identify and to as well to know and have a heads up about this amount of surveillance, because the city allegedly doesn't have money for permanent housing. It doesn't have money to support our communities, but it has $2 million and several change for providing state-sanctioned violence. And I'm not sure if Matthews, if you want to speak a little bit more about the process of the zine as well as the next steps.
Matthews here with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. And yeah, I just want to shout out the tremendous amount of work Nee put into the zine. There was a lot of input, and you know, they managed it beautifully and executed this wonderful, detailed, informational zine. And I do want to emphasize and uplift something that Nee did mention, which is that highlighting the anti-Blackness that kind of catalyzed all this violence was very important to us, and highlighting the fact that this took place in Lamert Park, before it happened at Echo Park, and how, this, although all that preceded 4118, this event also preceded 4118, it was very much like a rehearsal for how to automate these systems of displacement. But yeah, we're just excited to get it out there. And yeah, thank you, Nee, for all your hard work.
And I guess we can also open it up. So if anyone has any questions or comments about the zine, you can either put it in the chat, or you can also unmute yourself as well if you want to ask any questions or have any comments.
Cool. Well, this must be an amazing zine, which it is, so nobody has any questions.
I was just going to congratulate Nina on such a great zine. I know other folks had their hand in it, hand in the pot. But yeah, I am yes, I can't wait to distribute it and let folks know the crazy shit that's been going on with the criminalization of homelessness. Because every time I talk about it, people don't know that, people just are like floored, and it'll be good to have like actual visuals and stuff behind it. So that's great. Yeah, good job, y'all.
Thanks, Jella. And I saw right here in the comments or in the chat, Akil had asked about whether or not we've been in touch with some of the community that was displaced from the Echo Park Lake, and how they've been, or how they will be involved, or how they will be involved. Yeah. And so we have been in conversations, and we have continued to, as we have been developing this, we have been in conversations with the Echo Park Lake residents who were evicted from the Echo Park Lake. So that's something that we definitely did want to make sure that we not only were writing about the Echo Park Lake, but we were doing it and guided by community. And so we did have and make it intentional to have those conversations. And yeah, we will be continuing to have workshops, as well as uplifting the organizing work that the Echo Park Lake residents have been doing. And that's something that is going to be coming in the next few weeks. So I would encourage just to plug in through social media when we do have those follow-up workshops and webinars, where we will be continuing to have this conversation and go into it a little bit more in depth.
Thank you, Nina. Awesome. Great work. Just and I really appreciate, Nina, the way you were constantly sort of like reaching out to folks, getting people's feedback, including people who were folks who were directly impacted as a result of that, and being sensitive to just that how violently this action took place as well, and obviously just also acknowledging that before there was Echo Park, there was Lamert Park, and before there was Lamert Park, there was this constant 4118D, which is now been sort of all brought together in the overall 4118, is the violent impact and years and years and years of broken windows policing in Skid Row, thousands of things. So thank you, Cello, for also naming that as well. As collectively the Unhoused community gets impacted. So moving right along in the last 5 or 6 minutes, we also wanted to speak about, what is, since this is a general meeting, that what are some of the other things that the coalition has been engaging in, We have been reaching out to our partner organizations as well. We really want to get, just back on the streets. We've been kind of having this conversation as well, like, how do we bring this conversation back in person as well? But obviously, given the challenges that we have, and given this ongoing raging Delta viruses, so being very mindful about that too. We've been speaking to our folks in the public health field as well, just kind of guiding us as to what are some of the best ways, what are some of the best practices that we should be engaging in, just being very mindful of that. And just talking about just a couple of days ago, the LAPD officers sued the city for passing just passing certain restrictions and mandates and things like that. And this is an example that how LAPD and the law enforcement agencies, while they use this mantra of protect and serve, but it's very much grounded in the intent to cause harm. That how now they're weaponizing and with all the vulnerable communities and going into people's spaces, just where there's issues around interpersonal violence, or going and talking about robberies, or just stopping people on the street. We were looking at some contacts. And, LAPD over the last 10 years, and Matthias, remind me what those number was, maybe 8 or 10 million stops over the last 10 years. So, when you do an average of maybe about 1.5 million just stops a year, that is 1.5 million people through this COVID that have been been extremely vulnerable. So when you look at the population of the city of Los Angeles, it's not the county, and that's what the LAPD is covers that area, that it's almost like here you go, 1,443,000 individuals were contacted by LAPD. That's almost like 30% of the city's population is at risk of getting COVID as a result of their contact with supposedly who are there to protect and serve. So in a sense, this morning at the police commission, we were calling them as super spreaders. So if there is such a thing as a super spreader, there is one right there amongst our midst that is going around and spreading this thing. So just wanted to throw that. Couple things more where we're working on that report, the land and policing report, that hopefully should be finally released towards the end of October, that goes into in-depth detail about the connections between real estate developers, the city attorney's office, the LAPD, and various nonprofits into expanding and very methodically, the looting of land and banishment of people continues. So earlier, this conversation around settler colonialism, I mean, we have to really keep on bringing it up. Then people kind of look at it through their own vantage point, but that has not stopped. I mean, that has been in one form or another, one iteration or another, that keeps on expanding. So, and then obviously reaching out to our partner organizations, building that power on the ground. Want to do a shout out to Jessica Melendez, who really helped create a whole curriculum. And our goal is really to bring this conversation into, and we had a conversation with Youth Justice Coalition about youth organizing, and how are we bringing this conversation where we want to incorporate surveillance and the looting of the land into their curriculum as well. That how does it become a part of their learning cycle as well, on the regular too. So I'm gonna just with that, and thank you, the shout out for the LAPC Fails group that really keeps it going every Tuesday, and thank you to Adam and Tiff and all for getting those emails out and everything else. So I'm going to quickly pass it on to Shakir, since next Tuesday is our data-driven policing. Shakir, not to put you on the spot, but just to kind of give a quick snapshot of what we are planning, or if we had or anything people can expect next Tuesday's meeting, data-driven policing meeting.
Yeah, there are a couple things we talked about. Yes, so our data-driven policing work group meets on the first and third Mondays of the month, and we met yesterday. And what we were kind of thinking is two components. One is starting to share from the report that Hamid mentioned, which for now is titled "Whose Land? The Surveillance and Policing of Stolen Lands." And so that, starting to share some of the details that are going to go in that report, because it's a very long thing. And we, want to start just sharing that analysis and start planning, organizing around it. The other thing is, we're thinking maybe kind of like back to school themed is kind of sharing about our campus organizing, both in the past as well as some new stuff that we're getting. The coalition has organized a lot against academic complicity, especially LAPD's relationships to different UCLA academics, who help build surveillance technologies, as well as kind of help legitimize and reform and refine and surveillance and community policing and different tactics. So we've been getting a lot of records related to that. And so we're also trying to kind of build our campus organizing both at UCLA and at other places. So I think, I'm gonna try to talk about those two things.
Awesome. Great, thank you. So we got a couple more minutes. Any last minute comments or questions for the coalition? If folks who are in this meeting who are not very familiar with the coalition, we just posted our email address and our social media handles. Please hit us up. Anybody has any questions or comments? And maybe I was looking for it, so I couldn't find it. Either Shakir or Matthias or Nina, can either one of you post the link to our principles zine in chat, please? Thank you. Any questions, any comments, any thoughts? Any feedback on the third Tuesday of the month, what you would like us to bring in our general meeting? Just one of the things we want to do is to spend some time and going through our zine on values and principles, and there it is. And maybe just kind of just as a regular part of our conversation, start taking one of those at a time and breaking it down and spending a good maybe 15-20 minutes at each one of these general meetings to have that conversation. So we will start incorporating that starting in October to spend some time, because I think as abolitionists, as just in our journey towards liberation, it is critical that, again, we need to come back and re-anchor ourselves and be, again, self-reflective as to where we are going and how we claim these values and principles, but are we upholding those? Are we living those? Are we embodying those? So, Nina, Akhil, Matthias, Shakir, any last thoughts? All right. Cool. There you are, Shakir. any last thoughts or anything? Okay, awesome. Well, good. If nothing else, thank you all very much. This was very empowering, very inspiring, and really appreciate everybody being here collectively together. So we'll see you on the streets. We'll see you next Tuesday. And all power to all people. Thank you very much. Have a good night. Thank you.